Welcome back to Presidency Pending, the podcast bringing a distinctly Australian flavour to the burning questions in 2024's US presidential elections. I'm Clare.
And I'm Zim. We're both academics in Deakin School of Humanities and Social Sciences. This week, we are taking a deep dive into celebrity endorsements during election campaigns, comparing the American and the Australian experience.
So to date, we've heard from celebrities such as Taylor Swift, obviously, Billie Eilish and Billy Ray Cyrus endorsing Harris and Trump. So, Zim, tell me, how do celebrity endorsements affect voter perceptions of candidates, particularly, say, potentially younger voters?
Good question. So a celebrity endorsement is an endorsement from someone with a huge following, typically for reasons of music. That's often the celebrities these days, sometimes sports. If you go back further in time, people achieve celebrity for other reasons. In terms of understanding why celebrity endorsements matter, we think in political science that the people who follow celebrities often come to the view that their opinion matters and is something that should be followed. There have been tests of the importance of celebrity endorsement. The most important, well, one of the important tests has been studies of Oprah Winfrey's endorsement of Barack Obama in 2008, which was associated with apparently 1 million new supporters for Barack Obama. More generally, we think that celebrity endorsements matter to undecided voters. That's normally about 5 to 10% of the electorate, and they're particularly important for young voters. That's about sort of 15% of the electorate often.
Right. Thank you. The nerd in me really wants to ask how on earth you measure that, but I think maybe we'll leave that for a more dedicated political science podcast.
It's a good question. Clever research designs. Claire, how far back in US history do we see noteworthy celebrity involvement in elections, and how has it evolved over time?
I think it dates back to the 1920s, which is actually when you get the rise of the celebrity really in the form that we recognise it today. And that's because primarily of Hollywood. It's because of the communications boom that World War I engenders. And so stars, the famous example that we always trot out for first-year lectures is the house of Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, who wed. They were the king and queen of Hollywood, and their mansion in Hollywood was known as Pickfair. So the two of them got involved in one of Warren Harding's campaigns. So did Al Johnson, who was a singer, not a Hollywood star. He was the star of the very first talkie in 1927, which was called The Jazz Singer, in which he wore blackface. I mean, that's the very first famous Hollywood talkie. But a couple of years before that, he was for Harding, and I believe he was paid for this. And he released a song, The People for Harding or some such, and there was sheet music with his image and Harding's image side by side. So people would buy sheet music, play it on the piano at home. It was a big middle-class entertainment. So it dates back to the 20s. Then there's the odd one, but it's really then the 1960s with JFK's run for the presidency and that kind of, burnished image of the White House and Camelot and all of the things that went with Kennedy and that sort of mystique. So he was very closely associated with the Rat Pack, which are the group of singers of that era, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., others. Until he's not, actually. So for a while, he's very closely associated with them. It has evolved, I think. I mean, in some ways, it's the same. You're bringing the kind of publicity that comes with a big name, and that hasn't changed. I think the attention on younger voters has possibly changed because if you think about the 1980 campaign, when Ronald Reagan for the Republican Party came up against Jimmy Carter, who was in the White House and running obviously for the Democrats, they both. I mean, that was the first election campaign where both sides had this huge array of stars on their, behind them, I suppose. But they weren't young, and they weren't necessarily appealing, I don't think, to young people because we're talking like James Cagney for Ronald Reagan, and Muhammad Ali for Jimmy Carter, Willie Nelson. I guess I think of Willie Nelson as being so old that he was old then too, but perhaps not quite so old. But maybe attracting swing voters, as you said. That's always, in this election, it's the 6% in the 6 states or whatever the phrase is.
Yeah.
So it has evolved in one sense, and in another it hasn't.
Okay, interesting.
I think that's how I'd describe that.
Funny how notions of glamour have changed over time too.
Jimmy Cagney, not so much.
Yes. Imagine that today.
Well, I mean, Kid Rock.
Yeah, imagine that yesterday.
All right. Zim, can you discuss some of the most impactful celebrity endorsements in recent election history? Who were they, and what impact do we think they had on the outcome?
Well, the standard one for answering this question is the Oprah endorsement, which had a massive impact. As I say, about a million voters apparently changed their mind because
it does seem like an awfully round number, doesn't it?
It does seem like a round number, and I think it's important to bear in mind that a lot of that movement happened during the primary race. And I think that some of this discussion around endorsements doesn't do enough to distinguish between general election campaigns after the party's primaries and the primary process itself.
Right.
I mean, one thing that I should stress is that one of the purposes of endorsements is to bring signal in a very noisy, uncertain context. So during the primary race, typically the candidates aren't so different from each other. So there's a lot of noise there. And what the endorsements do is help voters coordinate, steer voters toward one candidate instead of another, when basically the various candidates are almost substitutes in terms of ideology and what they would mean for public policy. When it comes to the general election, especially in a polarized era, there isn't that sense of uncertainty, and therefore I think it's much more questionable how much movement can happen during an election, a general election campaign, and especially during an era of high polarization like the one we're in at the moment.
I would agree. I think, in fact, I just said not much has evolved. I think one thing that has changed is that some celebrities, if they decide that in a polarised election such as the one that is taking place now, that they may decide that they need to endorse a candidate. And I think this is precisely what's happened to Taylor Swift, who famously, if you're a Swiftie, or even if you're not, in 2016, when Trump ran for the first time, she chose not to endorse a candidate. And 2 years later, she had come to regret that decision and went on record saying so. And I think that's the one, and this is another example that is sometimes used, where she got out, 300,000 people registered in a very short time or some such. And in 2020, she endorsed Biden, and obviously more recently, she's endorsed Harris. And I think it's motivated partly by the sense of damage that would be done if she stayed aloof.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Though I do think that there must be commercial risks associated with that move, even if if you're Taylor Swift and you're thinking about this from a purely commercial standpoint, then probably nearly all your supporters are unlikely to vote for Donald Trump anyway. So maybe the risks are quite small. But still, for many celebrities, there are risks in putting off large sections of a very divided country. I mean, at the end of the day, America splits nearly 50-50, Democratic, Republican. There was, of course, the very famous quip by Michael Jordan, I believe, who refused to endorse a Democratic candidate, saying that Republicans buy trainers as well. And, that, in a sense, captures the idea that there's commercial costs to excluding partisans of either side.
Yes. And I think, that's why Swift's team said in 2016, don't endorse. But perhaps they've come around on... that's a good question. Has she done this? Okay, that would be going a little bit on a tangent. How much Taylor Swift can we bear?
Well, I'd be very interested. Obviously, she releases statements and so on, but I'd be interested in time to interview her and to know how she reaches a decision like that. Who's advising her? What's the logic behind it? How much of this is commercial? How much of it is personal? How much of it is, if you like, small p political? I think it's quite an interesting set of questions.
I cannot wait for you to interview Taylor Swift.
Yeah, I think we will have to wait for that one, unfortunately.
Let's see if we can get her on this podcast.
I can, however, ask you a question
All
now.
right, go on.
Have celebrity endorsements ever backfired on a candidate or caused unexpected shifts in the electorate?
I don't think there's a single kind of, it's not like the case of Oprah Winfrey, which is the kind of par exemple of how endorsements might move things. There's not one that comes to mind, but politicians do need to take care in selecting or agreeing to and liaising with celebrities. So the case here again is JFK, who was very closely associated with that Rat Pack and with the kind of cool of the 50s and 60s. And then famously, Frank Sinatra was hosting a very, very lavish, expensive, however many dollars a head dinner as a fundraiser for JFK. And Kennedy had recently learnt about, for listeners, I just cocked my head in a way that makes me conveys that I'm sceptical about this. He had just learnt about Sinatra's quite close ties to the mob. So he did not turn up to this fundraiser, and that was the end of that relationship.
I did not know that.
And in 1980, in fact, Frank Sinatra went for Reagan partly because he was still hurt by that snub. And likewise with Sammy Davis Jr., there was a big event in Washington and the Democrats did not invite Davis because he was married to a white woman, and that was still too controversial in the 1960s. And again, Davis took great umbrage at that. And so he supported Nixon in 1968. And there's a famous photograph of Sammy Davis Jr. Coming up almost like a football tackle. Comes up from behind when Nixon's at the lectern, grabs him round the waist for a hug. A great photograph of that, which in turn put Sammy Davis Jr. on the nose with potential black candidates. So when Jesse Jackson ran in the 1980s, he did not invite Davis to his events. So, I mean, this, in some ways it's small beans, and in others politicians need to be really careful.
Yeah.
But I can't think of a kind of really big example of it backfiring. Perhaps you've got one, but I can't think of a very, a sort of hugely unsuccessful one.
Yeah, not off the top of my head. I mean, I think there's quite a few examples where the endorsement didn't seem to have much impact. And that's, if you like, I think the default scenario. I think endorsements get a lot of attention. Their impact seems to be generally more marginal. I think of the many Hollywood actors and actresses, singers, Katy Perry springs to mind in particular, who endorsed Hillary Clinton. And that seemed to backfire. And she lost to Donald Trump, of course.
Yeah. Well, she didn't lose the popular vote, of course, but all that matters are those swing voters in the swing in the swing state.
They're the rules of the game.
Yes, that's right. I'm thinking too that it was an endorsement of sorts. I mean, the other thing that's changed is that sometimes these endorsements seem to come without any knowledge of the candidates.
Yeah, and I think from a political theoretical standpoint, that poses problems, or at least risks, because here you have voters who are following someone who has a big platform, but not necessarily a great deal of knowledge about candidates, issues, politics, public policy, and so on. And so the question is following celebrity endorsements better than the alternative? So who else would voters be listening to? And I think that's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question. Yeah.
Because for example, if celebrity endorsements are crowding out the endorsements of experts or party elites who have, on the side of experts, they have substantive expertise. If we're thinking about party elites, they have intimate knowledge of the personalities, the character, the leadership qualities of the candidates, then maybe the public are following noisy noise rather than signal, right? So you've got the celebrities who are saying stuff that suggests that you should converge on someone for reasons that may or may not be true.
Well, I mean, the perennial problem of reaching voters, right? Yeah. So I see what you're saying. And I guess the other ones that used to be very significant, and certainly in Australia, were editors in newspapers, right?
Yeah. Their endorsements used to matter a great deal.
Yeah.
But of course, newspapers have played the media system has played a huge role in the rise of celebrity endorsements too. Just thinking about the history that you've tracked. I mean, one could tell that story through the rise of newspapers, radios, cable TV, internet, social media. I mean, this is all in various ways helped to make celebrity more important.
In fact, if you think back to those 1920s celebrities, it's in these very novel magazines that are motion picture magazines that
Yes.
are being sold to teens and young people, young adults who are a new consumer market.
Yeah.
So they're with newly disposable income too. So all of this is kind of connected.
Yeah.
You've got consumers who think of themselves, whose citizenship is based, in fact, on consumption of luxury goods. I mean, famously, those Hollywood stars also backed deodorant, which, believe it or not, of course, is a luxury good. You don't actually need it. And that, the 1920s is full of sort of a remaking of Americanness as cleanliness. So, sorry, I might be diverting a bit, but that these things all go hand in hand, I suppose, and it really affects who people listen to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, I've got a question for you, Zim. Earlier in this campaign, Donald Trump shared an AI-generated image of Taylor Swift endorsing his campaign. What impacts do you think AI is having on this election?
I think AI is having an effect that we'll probably know after the fact. Certainly there is a huge amount of disinformation spewing from various quarters, both domestic and international. There are bots all over the place, I've been told.
Listeners and viewers, I'm the one who's very online of the two of us.
I've been told. I stress that. I'm less online than Clare. So this is all secondhand, of course. But from what I gather, the actual mechanics of the election will be very secure as they were in 2020 last time around. And so the question is, how does disinformation impact on voters' preferences? And I think that's a very, very complicated question. And it's one that we'll have to grapple with, I think, in modern democracies going forward as the information context evolves. But just on the question about the AI version of Taylor Swift, I did wonder the extent to which that would ever be credible, given Taylor Swift's very strong brand, which is youthful and it's progressive, and the people at her concerts are very obviously unlikely to vote for Trump. And I think if the AI version of Taylor Swift was endorsing Kamala Harris, then I think that we'd have credibility, plausibility questions to ask. But endorsing Trump, that always seemed a little bit far-fetched. So I wonder how much traction that was ever going to get. I think if you're a Swiftie, then the main options for your idol are to stay neutral or to come out for Kamala Harris. So in a sense, that's the choice that she's playing with. So I think anything that is beyond that range seems kind of implausible to the point that one would be skeptical if you saw AI along those lines.
I mostly agree, but it was either very soon after or very shortly before she endorsed Harris in that Instagram post signed Childless Cat Lady. A reference, obviously, to J.D. Vance and his sort of pro-natalist nuclear family vision of what the United States should be. And Taylor Swift is now in her mid-30s and Childless Cat Lady. There was a photograph of her hanging out with two very well-known Republicans, footballer and his girlfriend, Brittany, wife, I think. And this is one of those occasions where, as an Australian, I often read names and then I realise halfway through a lecture or a talk that I don't know how to say it. So Mahomes,
Mahomes, yeah.
Yeah, very famous footballer.
Very famous footballer.
And his wife. And Taylor Swift and the wife, Brittany Mahomes, were hugging. And this went all over social media. Is she a Republican? I must have been before. Is she a Republican now? How can she hang out with those MAGA people? So, maybe actually some people could have believed that Swift had changed sides.
Perhaps. And I think were the Republican candidate a more mainstream candidate and not Donald Trump, I think, that would be a more open question.
Sure. All right, I've got another one for you, I think. How does the role of celebrity endorsements in US elections compare to Australia? Are there notable differences or can you make comparisons?
Oh, good question. I think that America is more celebrity obsessed. I think there's certainly a celebrity aspect to Australian life, but the celebrities are fewer, they have lower status, and I think generally people adore them less, and their political involvement seems to be, my guess is, substantially lower than the activity of endorsements in American politics. I think part of it flows from my earlier point around the role and the prominence of the primary process in the United States, which I think opens itself up to celebrities playing a role as coordinators on a candidate. And I think the way Australian party leaders are selected is very different. And there isn't a role for the celebrity in that. That's very much an internal party affair. And then when we get to the general election, in both America and in Australia, a lot of the politics is structured by things that we know, like partisanship, the economy, so on. And so there's less space for influential endorsements of any kind, including by celebrities.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine how we might have responded in the late 80s if John Farnham had decided to endorse someone. I think there would have been a huge amount of scepticism and a bit of get your hand off it, really.
Yeah. Well, John Farnham endorsed the yes vote.
He did. Actually, there's an example.
And I think that's a very interesting example where the endorsements tended to line up on the side of yes. And, of course, yes was defeated. And maybe one might say that there's something quite Australian in, rejecting the choice of the establishment wherever it
or the tall
comes
poppies.
from. Exactly.
Yeah,
This is classic tall poppy, cutting down tall poppies. So maybe there's some of that. Certainly, I think for a politician in the current era where there's skepticism around elites, and that's not just in Australia, but I think one does certainly find that in Australia. I think it's risky to tie one stock too closely to establishments of any kind.
Yeah, very good point.
I've got a question for you. I might even have two in a row, Claire. First of all, how do you think the increasing involvement of celebrities in politics reflects broader cultural changes in American society?
Oh, that's a very big question.
It is.
Well, we've sort of touched on it, that the rise of celebrity culture and consumer culture generally is a big part of the story of the 20th century and 21st century in the West, not just in the United States, but certainly in the West. I mean, this is something that I take from Elliot Perlman's book $3. It was not that long ago that we did not hear at every hourly news update about the All Ordinaries Index or what have you, where consumption was not linked so closely to citizenship, or we didn't hear on the news about consumer confidence as a kind of sign of well-being, for example. So, and I think because celebrities are not just with political endorsements, obviously, but consumer goods, they're so tied up with both of those things, with all of those things, that certainly has been a huge cultural shift. Broad cultural change. You could make an argument, and I'm not the political scientist here, so I'm going out on a limb here, that presidents tend to be more celebrity-like in the last maybe since Reagan. They've got more riz, as the kids say.
Yeah. In political science, we don't use the term riz yet. We talk about the personalisation of politics. And indeed, when talking about how Australian politics has changed, many political scientists talk about the presidentialisation of politics. Tying in with the phenomenon you just observed.
I think some of ours are more presidential-like than others. But no, all the focus, you mean, on the single person?
Exactly.
Who is not elected directly by the people in that sense.
Yep.
Yeah, not for that role. Yeah.
And in a country where the executive is technically the cabinet, not the prime minister.
Yep. So I think that's the case. I thought over them. George H.W. Bush might be the exception. He wasn't exceptionally charismatic and certainly not celebrity-like, but the person he beat in 1988 was even less so.
Yep.
So, and then you think Clinton, you think Obama. I mean, these are stars. And in fact, I think this is something Harris is really needing to cultivate, because I don't think she's a natural in front of the camera. I don't think she's a naturally... Oh, she is if she's interviewed and she's comfortable. But I think, Bill Clinton is famously charismatic, right? Can work any room, but he's also great on camera.
Yeah, I mean, there has been this... Well, I suppose there is always some fuzzing of the boundary between celebrity and politics, but perhaps the boundary doesn't really exist anymore. I think Donald Trump is the case in point, obviously.
Yes, well, indeed. I mean, I've been thinking about his celebrity in the I mean, in the 1980s, he's got a cameo in Home Alone 2. I've recently been watching The Nanny again. They mentioned Donald Trump as surprisingly... They mention him surprisingly often in the early episodes. So it's not even later when they're kind of cultivating stars and bringing them in and what have you. Because he's a New York point of reference.
Yep.
And then he hosts The Apprentice for 15 years.
Yeah.
So he keeps that celebrity going with younger people, with migrants, with people who might not necessarily have known who the Trumps were. Yeah. He's got great brand recognition.
Indeed. And that segues quite nicely to my next question. How do you see the role of social media in amplifying the political voice of celebrities today compared to earlier eras?
Right. I mean, we've touched on this a little bit too. It used to be newspapers. If you wanted to be a celebrity endorser, you needed to get the attention of the media. Now we all have our own publishing houses in our telephones. You can, when Taylor Swift endorses, or when indeed Charlie XCX, the British pop star in her early 30s, announces just after Kamala gets the nod, or Biden steps down, she says Kamala is Brat.
Yep.
And a bunch of middle-aged people and older will go, what is that?
I include myself in that category.
So, I mean, yep, likewise, I needed it explained very carefully to me, but now I can pass this on to you.
Well, please tell us. The viewers would be interested to know what brat means in this context, because we all have our own notions of brat.
Look, there's no hard and fast definition. There is that one. Brat in this context is the title, I think, of her album that had a particularly sort of lurid lime green, or not quite lime, somewhere between lime and olive green cover. And Kamala Harris's team on the socials did a new image, cover image for her that was just in that colour as soon as Charlie XCX said this. Anyway, being Brat means being authentic, being not too concerned that your less savoury characteristics will put people off, just trying to accept yourself and to make the best of the better parts of you. That's how I understand it. I hope I've got it right. I've never felt more middle-aged than explaining this to you, knowing that an 18-year-old would be able to just tell you like that.
Well, there we go. I did not know that we lacked a word for that in the English language. But
well, and particularly it came out with a lot of young women saying they were going to have a brat summer.
Okay.
And this coincided with Biden stepping down, with Harris stepping up, and really, again, is testament to her campaign team that they grabbed this, and it got the attention of a lot of potential young voters, which are essential, of course, for Harris getting over the line in November. So in this case, it's a social media, it's a simple 3-word post. Kamala is Brat.
Yep.
By some very famous pop star, if you're of a certain generation, and they took it and ran with it.
Yeah, incredible.
But I doubt very much that they knew this was coming. And of course it could have just gone into obscurity.
Yep.
But this young woman has a reasonable profile. They saw an opportunity.
Yeah, and has a brand, it has a language that she can articulate with impact. It's impressive.
And for those of us who didn't catch it the first time, the way we caught it was a few days later when footage from CNN went viral of a bunch of 6 people using their reading glasses to try to explain to each other what Brat is, as I have just done to you and as someone did for me. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we all help each other to learn through this complicated era.
So social media is, in that sense, it's not just an amplification, it's an opportunity for some celebrities. None of us had heard of Charlie XCX. I'm pretty sure she would have passed me by entirely had I not. So she's broadened her market with this endorsement too.
It's a win-win.
Yeah. But as you say, the lack of oversight of these social media platforms is potentially a huge, huge issue for honesty, decency, trust in our public institutions and in our electoral processes, both in Australia and the United States.
Absolutely. Awfully hard to regulate properly, particularly when you think of the constitutional protections around free speech in the United States. Australia doesn't quite have those provisions, but I think in the United States context, what to do with the disinformation is a serious and ongoing problem.
Yeah, and it certainly could be here too. It could be universal, right?
I think it is. Yeah. It is here as well.
Zim, is there evidence that celebrity endorsements are becoming less effective or even irrelevant in our current media landscape?
I think there is at least circumstantial evidence insofar as endorsements by political endorsements, celebrity endorsements, Taylor Swift endorsements in that order of importance, insofar as they matter most for undecided voters. The number of undecided voters is decreasing, and it's low because of intense polarization. And therefore, the sort of people who'd be swayed by endorsements, there's fewer of them. We do know, however, that young people are often more likely to be swayed by an endorsement. And also, in the American context, you've got to bear in mind that persuasion is difficult. So trying to convince someone who voted Democrat 1 year and to vote Republican 4 years later is always a challenge. And therefore, the more effective tactic, if you're a political strategist, is to think about two cousins of persuasion, and that's activation and suppression. And you want to bring out your voters and suppress the votes of others, of your opponents. And endorsements are more likely to do that than actually to persuade, to rally your base, to get them to the polls. And in a tight election, even if there's a relatively small number of undecided voters, that can be decisive.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Claire, what are some of the key ethical challenges or dilemmas that arise when celebrities endorse political candidates or causes, and how might these impact the integrity of the democratic process?
I think we've touched on that too, that it's not an unmediated process to have an endorsement not be dropped into a pool of water and hang on, or is it a tree falling in a forest? It has to be... My metaphors are a problem for me.
An environmental phenomenon.
Nicely done. Yes, in order for it to be meaningful, it has to be amplified. And that's where I think the most serious ethical questions at the moment lie. And I think we've kind of touched on that most media is owned by partisan and very wealthy people. And there is no way to get that across otherwise.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah. Okay, how do political scientists view the crossover between pop culture and politics in modern elections? Is this a continuation of a long-standing trend or something new?
I think we've largely dealt with that. But just in a nutshell, I think political scientists are very interested in how politics in all of its forms have evolved and the role and interaction of culture in politics. And clearly we've talked about how that's changed and the role of celebrities in that. But I also think, and that we've touched on this a little bit, the deep fundamental normative questions around what this means for democracy, what this means for the role of knowledge in democracy, like who knows what, who has power over directing opinions, what are the role of party elites versus media elites versus celebrities from Hollywood and so on. And I also think that there's interesting questions about who makes up the party in the United States that political scientists are interested in. So it's not a coincidence that celebrities from Hollywood tend to endorse the Democratic Party. I think that in a conceptualization of the party system, it's almost fair to treat Hollywood elites as being at the core of the Democratic Party these days, in the same way that bankers were historically at the core of the Republican Party. So, the Democratic Party is the party of much of the cultural establishment, if you like. So I think that the way in which the cultural system interacts with the party system is an interesting set of questions as well. Thank you.
I'm just thinking of all those country music stars who are very much Republicans, and but they're not. They are expressly not Hollywood themselves. They are often very hostile, in fact, to. I'm not talking about particular country stars, but perhaps that genre. We've seen Beyonce's country album was not probably her finest album. I'm prepared to say that, and I'm a big fan. But she has not had a single nomination for the Country Music Awards this year, for example. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm quite surprised by that.
Yeah. So, for example, there is a kind of... So this is not just about, of course, culture and politics, but... as ever, about race too.
Yeah. And, when people speak of the culture wars, I think that's really evocative of the interpenetration of culture and politics in American life for decades.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, there's that last thing, I think this is probably something that's helpful here, and that is the virtual rally, so-called virtual rally, that Harris conducted last week, hosted by Oprah Winfrey. And this, again, kind of brings a lot of these things together.
Yeah.
It's an endorsement, it's a huge celebrity endorsement, but, Winfrey is more than just a celebrity endorser. She can move consumer markets.
Yeah.
And here, I thought it was kind of, I haven't seen too much analysis of the results of this. It was only Thursday night, and it was live streamed on Harris's YouTube channel, and people are coming to it still. I watched it on Sunday morning, for example. I think 1 million views within 24 hours. I don't know how long people hung around, but Oprah Winfrey has a huge reach to white women.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously to African-American women as well, but to that huge audience who she reached through daytime television. They trust her, they read the selections in the Oprah Book Club, and I think this is probably why she was hosting it in Michigan, swing state.
And she has such positive valence. You mention Oprah and people are either neutral or like her. Now, think of Donald Trump and Elon Musk as a sharp contrast.
Yeah.
Again, a man with a huge platform, loads of wealth. His endorsement could conceivably be worth a lot. But I imagine that it's on the whole a more complicated asset, if you're thinking about political capital, than Oprah's endorsement, which is unequivocally a positive. So I think, it's a bit of a contrast between those two.
That's well observed, yeah. All right. So that's it, I think. Have you got any more?
No, I'm done with my questions.
I think we've covered celebrity endorsement and some. And come back next week for our discussion of, unless something really happens this week that we can't resist talking about, presidential scandals.
Yeah, there might even be a scandal between now and then, who knows?
It's a pretty good chance.
Thank you for your interest in Australian and American politics. Please consider forwarding the pod to your friends and hit follow in your podcast app of choice. See you next time.